So many of us live in such a fast-paced and output-focused society in which we're driven and measured by the results that we produce. And in that sort of environment, perfectionism becomes one of those flaws that as a society we kind of weirdly value. It becomes a sort of flex or like a badge of honor that you can wear in creative or corporate circles. But the idea that truly great results are made manifest because of perfectionism is a myth. But before we get any further into this video, let's take a look at what perfectionism actually is. I've heard a lot of different definitions for perfectionism, but there are two that I find particularly useful. And the first of those two is that perfectionism is the practice of demanding of oneself or others a higher quality of performance than is actually required by the situation. So essentially demanding more than is required only to satisfy your perfectionism, not because the actual context of the situation requires it. The second definition is, I believe, a more recent and also a clinical definition, and it's a little bit verbose, so hang in there with me. It is that perfectionism is the overdependence of self-evaluation on the determined pursuit of personally demanding self-imposed standards in at least one highly salient domain, despite adverse consequences. So in other words, this definition posits that perfectionism is when, despite having adverse, unwanted, and possibly harmful consequences, you're still depending too heavily on your own evaluation of self-imposed standards. So rather than having some sort of outer criteria that anybody could see or judge by, you are relying on these inner and perhaps undefined criteria against which you're judging yourself. In the research, perfectionism is often divided into two different categories: adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism. Adaptive perfectionism is also sometimes referred to as excellence-seeking perfectionism, and it's when someone sets high standards for themselves, but they don't necessarily harshly criticize themselves if they don't meet those standards. And in contrast, maladaptive perfectionism, which is sometimes referred to as failure-avoiding perfectionism, occurs when someone is setting very high and sometimes unrealistic expectations for themselves, and they do harshly criticize themselves if they don't meet those standards. In maladaptive perfectionism, often the person is conflating their sense of worth with the perfection or non-perfection of the things that they produce. Unsurprisingly, a Harvard Business Review literature review found that maladaptive perfectionism was related to higher levels of anxiety, depression, burnout, and stress. And while adaptive perfectionism was related to higher motivation and engagement at work, neither form of perfectionism, not even the good adaptive perfectionism, neither one was related to higher performance. And while the researchers weren't able to determine exactly why perfectionism wasn't related to higher performance, they suspect that it's because any positive benefits of even the adaptive perfectionism were washed away by the negative consequences of those same tendencies. It seems as though a lot of self-proclaimed perfectionists don't want to overcome their perfectionistic habits because they're afraid of losing their edge. And so if that sounds familiar, just consider that the research indicates that perfectionism at best isn't related to the quality of the output, and at worst is related to some very damaging patterns and beliefs. And this seems like a good time to mention that there is a difference between striving for excellence and succumbing to perfectionism. It can be highly motivating to try to create really high quality work and to be conscientious and detail oriented and to be improving the caliber of what you create each time that you create it. But actual hardcore perfectionism, which remember is demanding more than is appropriate for the given situation, has so many adverse effects. Perfectionism can make even the smallest tasks feel absolutely monumental, which can lead to procrastination and just never getting started. Perfectionism can also be such a time sucker because you're wasting so much time on tiny little details that aren't even going to be noticeable when the final product is complete. And then what I believe is the most insidious consequence of perfectionism is that it prevents you from getting any real world feedback. So in order to learn and in order to grow, you need to be willing to put something out there and see what the effect is. What kind of feedback do you get? What worked? What didn't work? You need all that information in order to recalibrate the way that you're doing things and actually move forward and make progress. And if you're constantly being overly perfectionistic, you're not going to get things out there or make the mistakes that will allow you to get that feedback and move forward. So if you are a recovering or a want to be recovering perfectionist, here are a couple of things that might help you on that journey. The first suggestion is to be imperfect on purpose. And if this sounds really scary, then start with something that you don't care as much about or something that just isn't as important. So maybe you send an email without proofreading it. Something that will allow you to see that these little mistakes aren't going to have this huge adverse effect on your progress or the quality of what you are creating. It's almost like a little bit of exposure therapy where you can see that if you do make a mistake, it'll be okay. The second suggestion is to articulate your own standards for yourself. So with my own perfectionism, I found that I was often being a perfectionist in moments when I didn't even know what standards I was trying to achieve. It was just never enough, and I always had to make something more and more and more perfect. And so when I took the time to actually sit down and deliberately articulate what my standards for myself were, it helped me to kind of put it in perspective and actually see when I was meeting those standards so that I could know that once I've met those standards, I've done what I set out to do. Now, this still is going to take practice. You might meet your standards that you've articulated and then still feel like you need to tweak and make it more perfect, but it's at least somewhere to start so that you're aiming for something specific instead of reaching for this perfect ideal that is so undefined that you'll never possibly get there. Tip number 3 is to go big picture. When you find yourself stuck in really perfectionistic thinking and patterns and habits, allow your mind to kind of zoom out a little bit and see the perspective of what's happening. Whether that's zooming out on the timeline and thinking about what the impact of this will be in a month or a few months or a year or a few years, it can help you see what is actually going to matter long term, which can help you calibrate what you want to direct your attention towards. And then the other way to zoom out and bring perspective to the situation is just to consider some other impacts of what you're doing beyond the one metric that you're focused on making perfect. So for example, for this class that I was in a couple of years ago, we had to write these weekly papers that were 2 pages, and I would just spend hours and hours and hours and hours on these 2-page papers every single week because I was so focused on this tiny little paper, and my obsession with it was harmful to my mental health. It was taking time away from other things that I needed to be doing, and it just overall was not serving me. And so what I tried to do was to zoom out and see that the purpose of writing the papers, beyond just getting a good grade or making the paper itself perfectly perfect in every way, I could zoom out and see that the purpose of these papers was also to help me integrate my knowledge that I was learning, to help me articulate my own thoughts, to connect with my classmates over the topics. So once I started to see the other impacts that these papers had beyond the one metric of the actual quality of the writing that I was hyper focused on, it allowed me to relax a little bit. And it was still something that I struggled with, but it just gave me a little bit more room in which I could breathe and focus on producing a great paper without going absolutely crazy over it. The next tip is something that you've probably heard before, and it is the 80-20 rule, which says that 80% of the results come from 20% of the work. And I don't think that this is meant to be any sort of super exact rule, but the idea is that there are some things that you are doing that are having a bigger impact than others. It's similar to the law of diminishing returns, which is that at a certain point, when you keep working on something, the returns that you're getting for that work, the impact of that work, is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you can bring awareness to what those bigger impact things are, it might help you to loosen up a little bit about the things that aren't having as much of an impact and therefore might not matter as much. Another tip is to try to see if you can remember where that perfectionistic standard came from in the first place. If you are super perfectionistic about one thing in particular, see if you can maybe meditate on it or sit quietly with yourself or journal about it or even just talk to someone or think it out. See if you can remember where that standard came from. Was it told to you? Was it modeled to you? Was it pushed onto you by someone in your childhood? You might not be able to remember. I know for myself, there are some that I can remember exactly where that standard came from, and there's some that I must have just picked up over time. I don't know where they came from, but if you can remember exactly where a standard for yourself originated, you might be able to look back and think about why you adopted that standard, and if it's still something that you want to hold yourself to, or if it's something that maybe served you in the past but isn't serving you any longer. And I also want to say that if your perfectionism is sparking mental health struggles, or if you're feeling the need to dive really deep into your childhood or anything like that, if you're able to, I highly recommend seeking out professional help, because this stuff can be really hard and it can be so helpful to have someone who is qualified and licensed to help guide you through the process and to be with you while you're working on it. So I have one final last tip, and it's a tip that I have not heard anybody else share about perfectionism, but it is the one thing, more so than anything else, that has allowed me to get to the place that I'm at with perfectionism, which is, still in the process of recovering from being an insane perfectionist, but definitely further along than I have been in the past. And this is something that came to me one day, almost like an epiphany of sorts while I was in the shower, and it is essentially that if I am feeling very perfectionistic, I am focused too much on myself. Whether I'm aware of it or not, I'm focused on myself and whether I'm smart enough, articulate enough, respected enough, productive enough, all those things of these judgments about myself, whether I'm enough, rather than focusing on how I can be of use and good and service in the world. So a lot of the things that I get perfectionistic about are things that are services that I'm providing for others, as part of my work and my career. And when I get perfectionistic about them, it's because my focus has shifted to the wrong thing, which is my own ego and my own sense of am I enough, instead of the help and the service and the information that I'm trying to provide. So when I'm able to shift my perspective back over to the other person that I'm helping or that I'm trying to help, it just helps take this weight off, because it's no longer about me and if I'm good enough, and it instead becomes about the other person. So that last tip may or may not apply to you depending on what types of things you're perfectionistic about, but just trying to put it in perspective and take the focus off of yourself whenever possible, I think can be really helpful. So, perfectionism. It's tricky, it's tough, and I know the grip that it can have, and it's not something that is magically going to disappear overnight. But hopefully, if you are able to apply some of those tips, whichever ones resonated the most with you, you can begin your journey of overcoming perfectionism so that you can focus on the things that matter more and become happier and healthier and more content with yourself and what you're creating. If you'd like to see more videos about wellness, self-care, habit change, personal development, you can subscribe to this channel, and if you liked this video, I would so appreciate you giving it a thumbs up. It does a lot to help boost this video and boost this channel, which I really appreciate. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time. Bye.